In November 2003, two brothers stumbled out of the forest near Vernon, British Columbia, half-starved and claiming they'd been raised entirely off the grid by parents who'd chosen to disappear from civilization. They said they'd never been to school, never eaten birthday cake, never even visited a city. An entire community opened their hearts and wallets to save them. But what no one in Vernon knew was that these so-called bush boys weren't from the wilderness at all. They were from a quiet suburb of Sacramento, California, and every single word they'd spoken was a lie. The town of Vernon sits in British Columbia's Okanagan Valley, a place known for orchards and vineyards and the kind of small-town warmth where people still wave at strangers. And so, when a local woman named Tammy discovered two gaunt teenagers camping behind a grocery store in early November 2003, her first instinct wasn't suspicion, it was concern. The older one called himself William Green, and he said he was 22. The younger one went by Tom Green and claimed to be 15. They told Tammy an extraordinary story. They said their parents, Mary and Joseph, had raised them deep in the wilderness east of Revelstoke, about an hour's hike into the mountains. No electricity, no running water, no contact with the outside world. Their parents had chosen this life deliberately, rejecting modern civilization entirely. And so, naturally, Tommy asked why they left. William explained that he and his brother had grown curious about the world beyond the tree line. They wanted to see cities, meet people, maybe go to school for the first time in their lives, but their parents had refused, and so the brothers had packed what little they had and walked out of the forest with $200 and a tent. The details were heartbreaking. Tom, the younger brother, stood nearly 2 meters tall, but weighed only 38 kilograms. His ribs pressed against his skin like the bars of a cage. He explained that he was a strict vegetarian, eating only raw fruit, nuts, and uncooked vegetation, never root vegetables, never meat. It was, he said, how his parents had taught him to eat. William wasn't much healthier, his frame thin and weathered in a way that made his story of wilderness survival entirely believable. Tammy couldn't just walk away, and neither could the rest of Vernon. Within days, the community had rallied around the Bush Boys. Donations of food and clothing poured in. Townspeople pooled money to move them from their tent into a local hostel before winter set in. The Provincial Children and Family Development Ministry stepped in to provide Roen, or rather Tom, with welfare payments. Local families invited them for meals, bought them warm jackets, and treated them like the lost children they appeared to be. But there was one detail that should have raised flags much earlier. Despite claiming to have been born and raised just an hour from Revelstoke, a town of 10,000 people, no one in the region had ever seen these brothers before. No one remembered a family named Green living in the backcountry. No birth records existed. No school enrollment, no medical history, nothing. The Bush Boys had seemingly materialized from thin air, and yet the people of Vernon chose to believe them because the alternative, that two starving teenagers were lying about everything, was simply too cynical to consider. But as the weeks turned into months, Tom's health didn't improve. It got worse. His fruitarian diet wasn't a cultural practice learned in the wilderness. It was something far more dangerous. Despite the community's efforts to feed him, Tom refused anything that didn't meet his impossibly narrow dietary restrictions. His weight continued to plummet, and by early 2004, his condition had become critical. Therefore, doctors at Vernon Jubilee Hospital made the decision to admit Tom involuntarily. He was emaciated, malnourished to the point where his organs were at risk of failure. He would spend the next 33 days in the hospital, hooked up to IVs and feeding tubes, while medical staff fought to keep a 15-year-old boy alive because he wouldn't eat. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. RCMP Corporal Henry Prose had been assigned to the case from the beginning, tasked with establishing the brothers' identities so the province could provide proper support, but every lead hit a dead end. No Canadian birth records matched. No missing persons reports fit their descriptions. The brothers themselves offered only vague, contradictory answers when pressed for details about their parents or their life in the mountains. Prost was a methodical investigator, and something about the Bush Boys' story had never sat right with him. The older brother, William, was articulate and well-spoken for someone who'd supposedly never attended school. He knew things, pop culture references, slang, turns of phrase, that didn't match someone raised in total isolation. But without fingerprints in any Canadian database and no cooperation from the brothers themselves, Pross had hit a wall. Therefore, he decided to try something unconventional. He sent photographs of the two brothers to the San Francisco Chronicle, hoping someone on the American side of the border might recognize them. The newspaper ran the photos. CNN picked up the story. And within days, RCMP Corporal Price's phone rang with a call from Roseville, California, a quiet suburb 20 minutes northeast of Sacramento. On the other end of the line were Roger and Diana Horn, and they weren't calling about strangers. They were calling about their sons. Kyle Horn, 22, and Roen Horn, 15. But that wasn't even the most disturbing part of the revelation. Kyle, the older brother who'd been calling himself William Green, had been in contact with his mother Diana the entire time. He'd call periodically from Canada, telling her he was fine, that he was exploring, that he was safe. And then, casually, he would ask how Roen was doing, as though his little brother were still back home in California. Diana had no idea the brothers were together. Kyle had maintained this deception for months, assuring his mother that her youngest son was somewhere safe while Roen was actually starving in a Canadian hospital. The truth about why they'd run away was nothing like the wilderness fairy tale they'd constructed. In June of 2003, police officers and Child Protective Services had visited the Horn family home in Roseville. They were there because of Roen. The 15-year-old had been progressively restricting his diet, going from regular food to vegetarian, then vegan, then what investigators would later describe as fruitarian. His weight had dropped to dangerous levels, and authorities wanted to hospitalize him for treatment of what was clearly a severe eating disorder. But Roen didn't want to be hospitalized, and so he ran. Kyle, who had been asked to leave the house by his parents after refusing to find employment, took his little brother with him. They had $200, a tent, and a plan to disappear into Canada, where no one would force Roen into treatment and no one would ask Kyle to grow up. What they discovered next changed everything about how Vernon would remember the Bush Boys. The elaborate backstory about wilderness parents named Mary and Joseph, the claims of never seeing civilization, the wide-eyed innocence when someone showed them a television for the first time, all of it was theater. Kyle and Roen Horn had grown up in a middle-class California home with loving parents. They'd attended schools, seen doctors, eaten birthday cake. Kyle had fabricated the entire mythology, and Roen, desperate to avoid medical intervention, had played along. And so, when the parents flew to the Okanagan to reclaim their sons, the community of Vernon was left reeling. Tammy, the woman who had first found them and spent months advocating for their care, said publicly that she didn't regret helping them. But others weren't so forgiving. They felt manipulated, embarrassed that their generosity had been weaponized by two boys who'd exploited the very best instincts of strangers for their own purposes. The provincial government had spent thousands in welfare payments. Local families had donated money they couldn't easily spare, and the people of Vernon had invested something even more valuable than money. They'd invested trust. But the final indignity came from Vernon Jubilee Hospital. Roen Horn's 33-day hospitalization had generated a bill of $68,000. The Interior Health Authority sent the bill to Roger Horn in California, expecting payment for the emergency care that had likely saved his son's life. Roger paid a fraction, roughly $18,000. Then he declared bankruptcy. The remaining $50,000 was absorbed by the hospital system, a debt that would never be recovered. But what made it worse was what Interior Health Authority's chief financial officer Chris Mozakwicz revealed afterward. The Horn family had received insurance payouts related to Roen's medical care. They had the money. They simply chose not to use it to repay the hospital that had saved their son from starvation. Mozakwicz didn't hide his frustration. "This experience with the Bush Boys leaves me with a sour taste in my mouth," he said publicly. "We treated them extremely well." and not to be funded when the family received funding from the insurance company is extremely disappointing. And so the community that had opened its arms to two starving boys discovered that their compassion had been answered with deception, and the institution that had saved a life was left holding a $50,000 bill by a family that could have paid but chose not to. The Bush boys had run a special kind of grift, one that didn't target greed or vanity, but something far more vulnerable: human kindness. In the years since, Kyle Horn granted exactly one interview, a brief telephone call with a local reporter, roughly a year after the brothers returned to California. He offered no apology. He explained his deception matter-of-factly, as though orchestrating months of fraud against an entire community was simply something that had happened to him, rather than something he'd done. Roen Horn, the 15-year-old whose eating disorder had started everything, disappeared from public view entirely. Whether he received proper treatment, whether his relationship with food ever healed, whether the boy who'd rather flee to another country than eat a meal ever found peace, none of that is part of the public record. But the story refused to stay buried. A podcast called Wild Boys revisited the case in 2022, interviewing residents of Vernon who still remembered the two gaunt teenagers who'd wandered out of the woods 2 decades earlier. And now, in February 2026, a Paramount Plus documentary titled Wild Boys, Strangers in Town brings the full story to screen for the first time, with footage and interviews that had been in development for over a decade. Tommy, the woman who first found them, has maintained the same position for over 20 years. She doesn't regret helping. Even knowing everything she knows now, she'd do it again. Because the alternative, turning away 2 starving children on the chance they might be lying, is something she simply couldn't live with. And that might be the most unsettling part of the whole story. The Bush boys didn't exploit a weakness. They exploited a strength.